first act on, so please, lots of love and affection. Please go well, Grace. You ready for your first act? Yeah! Whoop and cheer and clap and do that kind of stuff? Yeah! Please welcome to sing,
Hello. I've got worms. I know that sounds like I'm oversharing, but I do. I have lots of worms. I have millions of worms. You see, I study worms. Yeah, I can feel the pity emanating up out of you. But you know what? I study one of the most fundamental biological questions there is. How do genes build a living thing? Like a human. Or a human. Or a worm. Now, as geneticists, we study genes by breaking them. So, in the case of the worms, we take a worm, we break one of its genes, and then we see what happens to that worm with the broken gene. And it's a really incredibly successful technique. Obviously not for the worm. Now, a lot of people, when they hear about what we do, they express mild disgust sometimes, but sometimes they say, how can you do that to those things? And I actually share those concerns. When I first started out in my career, I had some considerable concerns about genetics, and that's because I was reading at the time Lord of the Rings. Now there's a place in Lord of the Rings where Gandalf the Grey is going to visit Saruman the White. Now he gets there and he finds that Saruman the White is having something of a wizard's midlife crisis. He doesn't want to be called Saruman the White anymore. He wants to be called Saruman the Many-Coloured. And he explains this to Gandalf along the lines of, well, white light, when it's broken into its components, is colourful. Gandalf's disturbed by this. And he says, he that has to break something in order to find out what it is, has left the path of wisdom. So I thought, if I do genetics, will I have left the path of wisdom? So I thought long and hard about this, and I decided that I probably needed to get a life. So I became a worm geneticist. I can see you're masters of irony. And I haven't really looked back since, except at parties. At parties I tend to refer to myself as a geneticist and hope they don't ask what is it I work on. Because if I mention the worms, some people look uncomfortable and back away. Some people recognise that awkwardness and try and gloss over it by being enthusiastic about worms. And so they'll say things like, oh, worms, they're really good for the soil, aren't they? And is it true that if you cut a worm in half, the two halves each will become a whole new worm? And I look at them and I say, I don't know. I don't work on those kinds of worms. You see, the worms I work on are called Caenorhabditis elegans. Now, it's obviously Latin for something, but I never bothered to find out why. Because when people first told me what its name was, I thought, that sounds Welsh. So when I'm looking down the microscope, I think, there's Gwyneth, there's Gwendolyn, that one's Stacey. You see, they're all girls, my worms. There aren't many boys. There aren't many Reeses or Gareths. And they can get by with very few boys because they have this really interesting biological trick, which is they can switch sexes. So for a time they become male, and as males, of course, they make sperm. And they store that sperm away rather unsavourily in little bags called spermathecae, so that when they switch to being females a little bit later on, they can then fertilise their eggs with their own sperm. So they quite literally go and fuck themselves. This trick also means that they're incredibly prolific and fecund. That's the word fecund. So they can produce about 300 progeny in 3 days. So 300 offspring in 3 days, which is quite an impressive trick. Now obviously I spend a lot of time on my own. And so looking at the microscope, I often daydream about my worms, and I think, being able to make 300 progeny, that's almost a superpower. Imagine if humans had that kind of potential. You could create a little mini army of yourself, much like Agent Smith did in the crappiest of the three Matrix. But how would that happen? I mean, it would obviously, it's a superpower. So these days it would have to be some kind of genetic accident. Okay, we're done with radiation. And you're probably thinking, well, that sounds far-fetched. But actually, such an event happened to me about 2 years ago. I stabbed myself in the thigh with a glass needle filled with worm DNA. Now, nothing obvious particularly happened, disappointingly maybe. I did have to go and fill in an incident report form about it. It always struck me as I was filling in, Bruce Banner never had to fill one of these things. But imagine if it had taken. Imagine if my gonads had turned into worm gonads. In a very short period of time, copies of me would be emerging. Now, we won't speculate which orifice they'd emerge from. But just think, within 3 days, I would have created a small army of myself. And as I daydreamed, I thought, well, what would I do with this small army? I could get some of them to write grants. With that many people applying for grants, I found to get some of them. The others I could send away into the lab, and then the others could write up the papers. Meanwhile, I could swan around the world just going to conferences. It's a pretty good life. But it occurred to me that there's one major problem with this, in that each copy of me would also have the superpower. So they would also be producing 300 copies. So within 3 days there'd be 9,000 of me. Within another 3 days there'd be 27 million. And just shy of a fortnight there'd be 8.1 billion. I think somebody might notice. And I also doubled the world's population single-handedly. This daydream, though, did resolve itself for me, though, because I thought what I've done in my daydream is taken something which is almost limitless potential to take over the world. I could be an absolute evil genius. And what I did do instead was fantasize about just becoming a much better worm geneticist. Now, the charitable amongst you would say, well, that's good. That shows that you're happy in your chosen career. That's a rewarding thing to have done. Probably the less charitable ones of you will say, yeah, that just makes you a sad kind of loser. But one thing that did resolve itself from this was I think I've managed to come to terms with my initial misgivings with regards to Gandalf's views of genetics. Because although he would certainly disapprove of me breaking worms, I think he would certainly approve of the fact that I didn't use my superpower for evil. Thank you.